Most women stay far longer than their soul can bear, whispering to themselves that it's just a rough patch, that love means endurance, that perhaps with enough patience, he will remember the way he once looked at them. But beneath that hope lies a silent truth. The feminine psyche knows when love has turned from nourishment to starvation. When a woman continues giving long after she has stopped receiving, she begins to fracture. Not because she is weak, but because she has betrayed her inner archetype, the one Jung would call the anima awakened, longing not just for a man, but for meaning. Love, when unhealthy, becomes a mirror of her shadow, a projection of every unhealed wound, every abandoned part of herself that once begged to be seen. She doesn't just love him, she clings to what he represents, the fantasy of being chosen, the illusion of being enough. It's not him she can't let go of, it's the version of herself she's afraid to face without him. In the sacred theater of attraction, she forgets that a man can only meet a woman at the depth he has met himself. And many men walk through love half asleep, emotionally underdeveloped, carrying the emotional maturity of a boy hidden inside the armor of an adult. When a woman stays, hoping to awaken a man who refuses to awaken himself, she steps into the role of the unconscious mother, nurturing what should be a mutual exchange. This is where her spirit begins to bleed in silence. He may still touch her, still call her mine, but something in his presence tells her she is alone, even while being held. She looks into his eyes, searching for home, but finds only vacancy. Jung warned that when the projection breaks, love becomes unbearable, because what once felt like destiny now feels like abandonment wearing the face of intimacy. There comes a moment when she senses it, not in words, but in a quiet dread that settles in her chest. A moment where his presence drains more than his absence would. Her nervous system alerts her before her mind can admit it. Her body grows restless beside him. Her laughter becomes forced. Her silence becomes heavy. Yet she still stays. Why? Because the feminine heart would rather ache with familiar pain than step into unknown freedom. Attachment, especially for a woman who has not yet stood fully in her self-worth, can masquerade as love. The fear of being without him becomes larger than the pain of being with him. This is not weakness. It is conditioning. From a young age, she is told that a good woman heals, inspires, waits. But Jung would argue that this role traps her in a loop of projection. She gives him the potential of a king while he behaves as a boy. And in doing so, she silences the queen within herself. Here lies the truth most will not speak. Staying with a man who does not rise does not make her loyal. It makes her spiritually malnourished. Loyalty to potential is how women abandon themselves in the name of love. There is a difference between a man who is lost but willing and a man who is comfortable in her efforts to carry the relationship alone. The feminine essence can amplify, but it cannot resurrect what a man refuses to breathe life into. Walking away, even while loving him, is not a rejection of him, it is a reclamation of self. It is the moment a woman stops negotiating her worth in a place where it was never truly seen. Love, without reciprocity, becomes a slow erosion of dignity. And the longer she stays, the harder it becomes to hear her own voice beneath the noise of his needs. Some women wait for permission. They wait for a final betrayal, a clear explosion, some undeniable signal that it is time to go. But the most powerful departures are not loud. They are quiet, sacred, internal. They happen the moment she stops hoping he will change and starts remembering who she was before she began shrinking to be loved. The moment she realizes that loving him is no longer an act of connection, but an act of self-neglect. That is when true clarity arrives, not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper. It is time to go. She begins to recognize that love, when aligned with truth, should not feel like begging for emotional crumbs. The ache in her chest is no longer just longing. It becomes a warning. A woman's intuition, once ignored for too long, transforms into a quiet rebellion. She no longer cries in the same way. Her tears change flavor, not of desperation, but of awakening. The sorrow shifts from "why won't he choose me" to "why have I forgotten to choose myself?" This is the sacred threshold Jung spoke of when he described individuation, the moment the self refuses to remain fragmented to maintain an illusion. She stands between two identities, the woman who stayed trying to be enough and the woman who leaves knowing she always was. Most never cross this threshold because the ego clings to narrative. The ego says, "You've invested time, love, effort, don't walk away now." But the soul whispers back, "Staying will cost more than leaving ever will." This inner conflict is the true battlefield, not the man, not the relationship. The war is within. A woman conditioned to believe that love is sacrifice finds it almost unbearable to choose herself over a relationship. But there's a difference between sacrifice and self-abandonment. True feminine strength is not found in how much she can endure, but in how clearly she can discern when endurance has become self-erasure. In the ancient archetypal dance, the feminine is intuition, depth, and embodiment. When she silences her inner voice to maintain external peace, she is no longer embodying the feminine. She is betraying it. Modern psychology speaks of trauma bonds, of the addictive loops created by inconsistency. A man who gives just enough affection to keep her hoping, but never enough presence to make her feel safe, becomes the architect of her emotional volatility. But Jung's shadow work reveals something deeper. She is not addicted to him. She is addicted to the version of herself she imagines in his presence. The fantasy of being the woman who finally softens him, heals him, inspires him to grow. In this fantasy, she becomes savior, but in reality, she becomes prisoner. To walk away while loving him is the ultimate initiation into self-worth. It is to understand that love without mutual respect corrodes the spirit. It is to embrace the discomfort of letting go over the slow death of staying. Men who are not ready for depth will always interpret her leaving as impatience or emotional instability. But women who have been awakened by suffering no longer seek validation from those who contributed to their pain. She begins to see his patterns clearly, not through the eyes of longing, but through the lens of truth. His avoidance is not mystery, it is emotional immaturity. His inconsistency is not passion, it is a lack of integrity. His silence is not depth, it is emotional cowardice. These realizations do not come in anger, but in clarity. And with clarity comes grieving, not of him, but of the illusion she once held so tightly. The Stoics taught detachment, not as indifference, but as a mastery of one's own soul. Marcus Aurelius spoke of the discipline of perception, to see things as they truly are, not as the heart wishes them to be. This is where the modern woman meets ancient wisdom. When she no longer romanticizes his potential, she begins to measure him by his actions. And in that sacred moment of honesty, she understands that loving him does not require her to remain with him. Somewhere in this awakening, she notices her body responding differently. There is a calm beneath the grief, a strange peace beneath the sorrow. This is the sign she has stepped out of emotional survival mode and into spiritual clarity. She starts to reclaim small parts of herself, her laughter, her creativity, her inner silence. She reconnects with the parts of her that existed before she made him the center of her emotional universe. He may not understand it. He may even try to pull her back into the familiar cycle, offering sudden bursts of affection when he senses her distance. But the woman who has tasted even a moment of self-recognition cannot fully return to the role she once played. The game begins to look different. The pedestal she once placed him on begins to crumble, not because he changed, but because she finally opened her eyes. And once a woman sees clearly, love alone is no longer enough reason to stay. It is here, in the raw space between staying and leaving, that a woman encounters her shadow in its truest form. Jung taught that the shadow is not only the darkness we fear, but also the dormant power we have suppressed. Her shadow is the part of her that knows she deserves better, the part that has always known, but was silenced by fear of being alone. She starts to recognize the deep truth. Staying in a love that diminishes her is a form of self-rejection. Leaving, despite still loving him, is an act of radical self-acceptance. The emotional conflict intensifies because love itself is not binary. She may still love his voice, his touch, the warmth of his presence on good days, but she begins to see that love without emotional safety is not love. It is spiritual tension. His arms may still feel familiar, but familiarity is not the same as destiny. Many women confuse emotional habit for soul connection, mistaking intensity for alignment. Intensity often comes from emotional chaos, while true alignment feels calm, steady, grounded. Her body begins to crave peace over passion, respect over attention, depth over drama. At this stage, her mind tries to bargain. It tells her to wait a little longer, to give him one more chance, to communicate better, to love harder. But her intuition grows louder. It speaks not in loud demands, but in subtle discomfort, tightness in the chest, exhaustion after every interaction, a sinking feeling after every unanswered message. In Jungian psychology, this is the anima's cry for individuation. She is being pushed by her soul to step out of the role of rescuer and step into the role of sovereign. The queen within her begins to rise, not with arrogance, but with sacred self-respect. He may notice the shift. Something in her energy changes. She no longer chases reassurance. She no longer reacts with the same desperation when he pulls away. She moves with quiet observation, watching his patterns with new eyes. The spell breaks. She stops believing in his excuses because she recognizes that a man who truly values her presence would not repeatedly risk losing it. This recognition doesn't come with hatred. It comes with profound sadness. Not hatred for him, but grief for the parts of herself she abandoned for the privilege of staying close to him. A woman who has begun to heal no longer seeks emotional permission. She stops waiting for the perfect moment to leave. There is never a perfect moment. There is only the moment where self-preservation outweighs longing. She realizes that her desire to be chosen by him blinded her from noticing whether he ever truly chose her beyond convenience. Emotional immaturity often disguises itself as love. A man can say he loves her and still repeatedly choose his comfort over her peace. And when a woman sees this clearly, love becomes secondary to self-protection. She begins to disconnect emotionally before she ever walks away physically. People mistake her silence for surrender. They assume she has given up. But silence for the awakened feminine is not defeat. It is preparation. It is the inner gathering of strength before a sacred departure. She does not always leave with a dramatic final speech. Sometimes she simply stops fighting. She stops explaining. She stops hoping. She looks at him with the stillness he does not recognize, and that stillness is the sound of her soul reclaiming itself. In this quiet transition, she reflects on the archetype of the phoenix, burning not because she was destroyed, but because transformation is an act of fire. To walk away while still loving him is to let love exist without needing to possess. It is the highest form of emotional mastery, to release what she wanted while making space for what she deserves. She does not need him to be the villain. She does not need to prove he was wrong. She only needs to acknowledge that staying has become a form of self-harm. This is the moment many never reach because it requires a kind of bravery beyond anger. Anger makes leaving easier, but clarity makes leaving permanent. And once a woman reaches clarity, she understands something vital. Loving someone does not obligate her to tolerate emotional neglect. She can love him and still choose to walk away. She can grieve him and still choose herself. She can hold tenderness for what was and still step forward into what could be. And that is the quiet power of the awakened feminine. She learns that self-love is not a concept, but a decision. In the wake of this awakening, she encounters a deeper truth, one that is often hidden beneath layers of romantic idealism. Love is not meant to be proven through suffering. The notion that endurance equals devotion is a cultural imprint, not a spiritual principle. Stoic philosophy teaches that what diminishes the soul must be released, no matter how deeply it was once cherished. Seneca would argue that to cling to what harms is a form of madness. Jung would say that clinging reveals an unconscious attachment to an archetype, not to the actual person. She begins to see that what she loved in him may have been the projection of her own unclaimed potential, mirrored back through a masculine form. This recognition is not cruel, it is liberating. She is no longer captivated by his potential because she sees the truth. Potential without action is a mirage. Many men live in the shadow of who they could be, relying on a woman's emotional labor to feel momentarily whole. But a queen does not lose herself in the rehabilitation of a man who refuses to meet himself. The deeper she steps into her sovereignty, the more she understands that love must be reciprocal in responsibility, not just in sentiment. The emotional body begins to adjust. Where once there was desperation, there is now contemplation. She starts asking different questions. Not how do I make him love me more, but how do I love myself enough to stop forcing what no longer aligns? This shift in focus signals the true beginning of detachment. Detachment, in its purest form, is not the absence of love, but the presence of clarity. She still feels for him, but her feelings no longer override her instincts. The emotional storm begins to settle, replaced by a steady internal knowing. Shadow work teaches that what triggers us reveals where we are still bound. Each time he disappoints her, it becomes less about him and more about what within her keeps accepting the minimum. She examines her patterns with new honesty. Did she mistake chaos for passion? Did she confuse unpredictability with depth? Did she label inconsistency as mystery just to avoid acknowledging his emotional unavailability? These questions do not arise from blame. They arise from awakening. A woman who turns inward for answers stops giving her power away through accusation. She begins to understand that awareness is liberation. As she grows in emotional intelligence, she no longer seeks to change what he does. Instead, she observes what she tolerates. And in that observation, she begins the process of psychological recalibration. The nervous system, once addicted to emotional highs and lows, begins to crave emotional consistency. She realizes that peace is not boring, it is sacred. The feminine heart, aligned with truth, no longer aches for what is unstable. It learns to find beauty in reliability, strength in calmness, intimacy in mutual presence rather than dramatic pursuit. This shift confuses those who once held emotional power over her. He may attempt to rekindle the dynamic through old tactics such as withdrawal, breadcrumbing, or sudden affection after periods of distance, but these patterns no longer hypnotize her. She has seen the pattern behind the performance. The emotional hook loses its grip because she no longer interprets inconsistency as passion. She recognizes it for what it is: emotional immaturity wrapped in shallow intensity. Love, she now understands, is not meant to feel like constant guessing. It should not demand the abandonment of intuition. The feminine essence thrives in environments where her emotional intelligence is met with presence, not avoidance, with leadership, not passivity, with truth, not ambiguity. And once she tastes even a moment of that kind of alignment, whether through solitude or a rare glimpse of genuine connection, she no longer fears walking away because she knows what she's capable of receiving. The deeper she steps into this realization, the more she becomes a mirror to herself rather than to him. Jung taught that true integration of the anima begins when a woman stops projecting her inner longing onto external figures and instead turns toward her own soul as the source. This turning inward is not isolation, it is restoration. She begins to rebuild from the inside out, honoring each emotion without becoming enslaved to it. And in this emotional maturity, she discovers that love is not lost when she walks away. It simply changes direction, redirected back to herself, where it always belonged first. The departure is no longer an escape, but an evolution. When she finally gathers the strength to prepare for her departure, something profound happens. Her energy shifts from yearning to acceptance. Acceptance is not apathy, it is the recognition that even love has a sacred threshold. She understands now that love cannot save what does not want to be transformed. Jung would say that one cannot force individuation upon another soul. Each must meet their own shadow. And if he has chosen to remain asleep, her awakening will feel like abandonment to him. But to her, it feels like resurrection. He may notice that her softness has changed. It is no longer softness born from hope, but softness born from wisdom. She no longer pleads, no longer explains the depth of her pain, because she finally realizes that some truths are not meant to be explained, they are meant to be embodied. Her silence, once a cry for attention, becomes a quiet declaration of sovereignty. He senses this shift and feels a loss he cannot name. He did not believe she would ever truly leave. Most men don't, because they mistake feminine endurance for dependency. But endurance has a limit when dignity awakens. As she begins to detach, she also begins to grieve. Not just him, but the story she built around him. The fantasy dissolves slowly. She sees clearly that she wasn't just losing him, she was losing who she believed she was with him. The grieving process becomes less about what he did and more about what she tolerated. She feels the weight of her own self-abandonment, but instead of drowning in guilt, she allows it to sharpen her self-awareness. This grief does not break her, it refines her. Detachment allows her to view the dynamic through a more objective lens. She sees how often she tried to earn love rather than receive it. She sees how she interpreted his emotional absence as a challenge rather than a boundary. She sees how her heart tried to translate inconsistency into growth, when in reality it was simply inconsistency. There is no anger in this clarity, only a calm understanding that love without alignment is simply longing misplaced. And yet, beneath this clarity, she still feels it. The love. The memories linger and her body still remembers. This is the hardest part, to walk away while threads of affection still pull at her spirit. It is far easier to leave what is clearly toxic, but to leave what still holds fragments of beauty requires a deeper strength. This kind of departure is not fueled by hatred, but by reverence for her own soul. She no longer leaves because he is unbearable. She leaves because she refuses to become a lesser version of herself just to stay. This kind of emotional maturity transforms the way she holds love. She no longer views love as something to grip tightly, afraid of losing it. She begins to see love as something sacred that must be matched in depth and effort. Anything less is not love. It is longing dressed in hope. She understands that love without mutual devotion drains rather than uplift. A woman aligned with her inner truth understands that a man must rise in self-awareness to truly meet her. If he does not, she does not shame him. She simply steps back and continues her own ascent. By the time she reaches the door of her departure, something sacred has already shifted within her. She does not leave with a heart full of bitterness. She leaves with a heart full of knowing. Knowing that to remain would be to dim the light of her own becoming. Jung spoke of individuation as the journey toward wholeness, a process that often requires the death of old identities. The version of her that begged to be chosen begins to dissolve, making space for a woman who no longer seeks permission to exist fully. In the past, love felt like longing, a constant reaching towards something that always remains slightly out of grasp. But now, she feels the beginnings of a new kind of love, one that begins inside her, steady and undemanding. It does not rush, it does not chase, it simply exists. This inner love becomes her anchor, a quiet assurance that she is capable of holding herself in the ways she once begged him to. She starts to understand that no man can truly love a woman who has abandoned herself, because love cannot reach what isn't present. When a woman begins to love herself with sacred regard, she no longer confuses attachment with devotion. She can love someone and still walk away if the connection threatens her peace. She understands now that staying in a place where she is unseen is a betrayal of her feminine essence. The feminine does not thrive in emotional poverty. It requires depth, presence, emotional reciprocity. A man who cannot meet her there does not become her enemy. He simply becomes part of her past. Not a failure, but a teacher. Not a wound, but a mirror. This stage of transformation feels like standing on the cliff, terrifying, yet exhilarating. She feels the pull of the familiar behind her and the call of the unknown before her. The unknown once felt like danger, but now it begins to feel like possibility. She realizes that walking away is not just an ending, it is a sacred opening. An opening to a life where love is not something she chases, but something she attracts from a place of self-worth. And self-worth, once awakened, is a force no external relationship cannot weigh. The man she leaves behind may feel the weight of her absence. Her presence once filled the emotional space with warmth, with intuitive understanding, with care. He may try to return to reclaim what he did not nurture, but by then, the woman is no longer waiting. She may still hold love in her heart for him, but is no longer the kind that binds. It is a quiet love, distant and gentle, a love that wishes him healing but refuses to sacrifice her own. This is where many confuse her calmness with indifference. But there is a difference between indifference and liberation. Indifference is cold, dismissive, born from avoidance. Liberation is soft, rooted, born from truth. She carries no spite, for spite is a chain. She carries no score, for scorekeeping is a prison. She carries only wisdom, for wisdom is freedom. And in this freedom, she finally understands. Healing was never about erasing love. It was about expanding beyond what love once meant.